JP, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, which is associated with Biola University. I don't know if you've heard of that. He received a bachelor's in physical chemistry from the University of Missouri, so I would say that. THM in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, an MA in philosophy from the University of California in Riverside. Oh yeah, then a PhD in philosophy at the University of Southern California. He's authored, edited, or contributed to papers in 95 books, including Does God Exist?, Consciousness and the Existence of God, The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, and Debating Christian Theism. He has also published over 85 articles in journals such as Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, American Philosophical Quarterly, Religious Studies, and Faith and Philosophy. Moreover, JP was selected in August 2016 by the website The Best Schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers. It's a great privilege to have JP Moreland speak to us this evening. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank you again on behalf of my colleagues for coming and being with us this evening. My job was to edit and to contribute 2 chapters to the philosophical section of this hernia-inducing book, and I was privileged to do that. This coming August will mark 3 years that I began a battle with 3 different forms of cancer and that I continue to this day to be fighting. I don't know how long I have. I could have 15 years. I get tested every 6 months, and my tests are clear at this point, but I'm looking forward to dying. It's going to be a wonderful time. I'm really very serious about that, not the process, but the event itself. But what is interesting is these cancers, the one on my colon involved 31 lymph nodes, and it was a massive tumor, had actually been developing for years, just beneath the surface, and I didn't know it. And during that time, I was concerned with things that were kind of more pressing, like I turned 70 in 2 days, and my ankles were getting stiff. I'd get up in the morning, and I'd have to loosen them up. And some other minor health issues regarding skin cancers and things like that. But little did I know that my attention to these kind of more surface issues, while I was doing that, underneath the surface, there was this growing malignancy that could very easily destroy me. Now, I think the same thing is happening with theistic evolution in the church. In the church, we're involved with trying to have small groups and to get our worship down and to have preaching that sort of relates to unbelievers. Not against all that, but all of that is sort of, in my opinion, surface issues, while we are allowing the worldviews in our culture to slowly permeate like leaven our churches. And it is increasingly causing people to lose confidence in the Bible. One of the reasons young people are in the church are sexually active is they simply don't believe Jesus knew what he was talking about. They don't believe that virginity is actually the path to a flourishing life. And so they take the Bible not to be authoritative. It's something from an old crudgety curmudgeon God, and it's not for today. Now, as a result of that, in addition to the doctrinal issues that Wayne is so good at laying out, there's another issue going on with theistic evolution, and that is the question of who gets the right to define what's real. Who has that right? Well, the answer to that is the person who has knowledge. A person who has knowledge of dentistry has the right to tell us how molars work. A person who has knowledge about a certain range of study has a right to tell us about literature. So it is on the basis of knowledge that people have authority to speak and act in public because they know something that makes them an expert or allows them to conduct those activities. But what theistic evolution has done, as I'm going to show you now, has actually contributed to something called Scientism, which has the price that we've paid for that is that we've allowed people to come into the faith because we don't want to cause them to balk at theistic evolution or at evolution. But the price is that as a result, people no longer regard the Bible as a source of knowledge. They instead embrace what's called Scientism. Now, there are two forms of Scientism. There's strong and weak Scientism. Strong Scientism is the idea that the hard sciences are the only source of knowledge and truth about reality. Anything outside the hard sciences, the humanities, good Lord, theology and ethics, is simply nothing but personal, private feeling and emotion. And we must tolerate these personal opinions because nobody knows who's right. And there probably isn't anybody right when it comes to ethical and theological issues. As an illustration of this, years ago I was giving an evangelistic talk at a little dessert in a person's home. And one of the Christian brothers said he was inviting his boss, who had a PhD in physics from Hopkins and had been an engineer for about 20-some years, and that he hated Christianity. And he actually went out of his way at work to badger Christians at the coffee pot and go after them for their Christianity. And I said, well, thanks a lot. So I'm there, and I'm at the hors d'oeuvre table, and I can see my friend come in, and he's got an older gentleman with him, and it's obviously his boss. They make a beeline to me, and my friend introduces me to this gentleman, and after we exchange pleasantries, he says, say, I understand you're a philosopher and a theologian. And I said, well, I give it my best effort. And he said, yeah. He said, you know what, I used to be interested in that stuff too when I was a teenager. But when I grew up and matured intellectually, I began to realize that if you can't quantify it and measure it and test it empirically in the lab, it's nothing but hot air and empty opinion. I had a woman come up to me before this gathering saying that a dear friend of hers is undermining and leaving the faith because he believes that science has undermined belief in God. Now, that's what this gentleman was expressing with Scientism. Strong Scientism. Only the hard sciences can tell us what's true and real and that we can know. It's the scientist who speaks with authority today. Now, the problem with strong Scientism is that it's obviously self-refuting. Because the statement, the only thing that you can know and that can be true of reality is what can be tested by the hard sciences, cannot itself be tested by the hard sciences. Therefore, it fails to live up to its own criterion of acceptability. It's like saying there are no sentences of English longer than 3 words. That sentence is self-refuting. And so I let the gentleman talk for about 2 minutes. And he made, I'm going to guess, 20, 30 assertions. And I stopped him and I said, look, I'm confused and I got a problem and you got to help me. I think what you're saying is that if the only thing that you can really know is what can be true is what's tested in the hard sciences. Everything else is hot air and personal opinion. That's what he said. He said exactly. And I said, well, you've uttered about 20 or 30 assertions, and I can't think of a single one of them that could be tested by the empirical sciences. Now, if I'm wrong, would you tell me which assertion you've made that can be tested by the empirical sciences? But if you can't, my dilemma is that what you've been doing for the last 2 minutes is spewing hot air and idle opinion. It was self-refuting. Now, there's another form of Scientism that we mention in the book called weak Scientism. This allows that there might be some low-grade, justified beliefs outside of science. But it still holds that science is by far the most authoritative specter of knowledge, so that if philosophy and science come into conflict about whether there's a soul or whether you're just your brain, science is going to win that debate because it's got more authority than philosophy, even though philosophy may have a little bit of low-grade authority. Now, there are a lot of difficulties with weak Scientism, and I'm going to list 2 of them very quickly. And for one thing, Weak scientism does not allow for the stating and justification of its own assumptions, of science's assumptions. Science makes assumptions. It assumes that there's such a thing as truth and that it's a correspondence with reality. It assumes a fairly clear definition of knowledge as a true belief that's based on good evidence and good grounds. But none of these assumptions can be tested by science. Now, science cannot be any stronger than the assumptions on which it's based. Since weak scientism undermines the defense of the assumptions of science, it's actually a foe of science and not a friend, because those assumptions have got to be defended philosophically, not scientifically. So, weak scientism undermines science by failing to provide philosophical justification for the assumptions of science themselves. The second problem is that we know things out of sight of science. And that's just a plain fact. As a matter of fact, we know some things outside of science with far greater rational support than we know in science. For example, there are certain propositions in ethics that we know with more certainty than we know that there are electrons. And I'll give you an illustration of this. After my colon cancer surgery, my stomach wouldn't come back online, so I was in the hospital 9 days. And I saw all kinds of nurses come in on different shifts. And one day this chipper nurse comes in, and she says, "Well, how are you today?" And I said, "I'm hanging in there." And she says, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I was actually majored in physical chemistry in my undergraduate work, but then I went in and did a THM in theology and an MA and a PhD in philosophy, to meet USC, and I'm a philosophy professor." And there was a puzzled look on her face. This actually happened. I said, "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to predict what you're thinking right now, and you tell me if I'm wrong. What I believe you're thinking is, gosh, you started off in a field of study where there are hard facts, and you can really know whether you're right and wrong, and you went over to this stuff where nobody knows who's right, and there's just a bunch of opinions, and it's largely just about kind of saying whatever you want." She said, "That's exactly what I was thinking." And I said, "Well, I got to tell you, you're dead wrong about that. In fact, it may be the opposite. I know an ethical claim with more certainty than I know that there are electrons." And she looked at me like I'd parsed every Hebrew verb in the Old Testament. I mean, she was just... She said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, take the claim, torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong. I have more rational support for that than I do that there's a belief in electrons, and here's why." I said, "Do you know anything about the history of the electron?" "No." "Well, I do. I've studied it from J.J. Thomson all the way up the debate between German wave theorists about the electron and the British particle theorists, all the way to the Bohr electron, up to the quantum electron. And if you ask me, do I believe in electrons, I'm going to have to ask you, which one did you have in mind? Now, you probably mean the present one. But look, is it beyond reasonable doubt that 50 years from now we will no longer believe that the electron as we currently conceive of it exists, given the history of the electron, and we might believe something completely different exists? Is that conceivable to you? Well, sure. Now, I said, it's not conceivable to me that in 50 years we will find new evidence that will make the assertion torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong rationally incorrect. Now, don't get me wrong. I can imagine a situation where everybody in society would believe in torturing little babies for fun, but I can't think of rational evidence that would come in that would make that assertion obviously an irrational one. Thus, I have greater certainty in an ethical claim than I do in a scientific claim. My point? I don't know, but it was an interesting story. Now, my point is that there are areas of knowledge in theology and in ethics that we know with greater certainty than some of the assertions in science. And it goes both ways. There are sources of knowledge outside of science, and we need to learn to live with that fact. Now, the problem then with theistic evolution is that it reinforces a commitment to scientism, and you end up with a revisionist view of the Bible. Now, some people say, look, theistic evolution is what allowed me to embrace Christ because I had a problem with creation and I would have never become a Christian if I hadn't had the option of theistic evolution. Now, my response is the following. Number one, if you're talking to somebody about Jesus and they want to talk about evolution, my view is to say, look, let's not worry about that right now. Let's kind of stick with what you think of Jesus, and let's get to that later. But I'm not going to tell them it's okay for you to believe in that right now, because first of all, I think what Steve Meyer and others have done is shown that we don't have an obligation to do that, and we've actually got biblical grounds not to. But the other reason is that if I tell a person, hey, there's no problem with that, and they become a Christian on that basis, they've already started a revisionist project in the Bible, because they've revised the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And then when it comes to when neuroscientists claim there's no soul, well, of course, we'll have to revise the Bible. No problem with that. The Bible's not a science textbook anyway. And by the way, there's no gender, we've learned in science. Okay, no problem with that. And we've also learned that homosexuality is a deterministic factor by your genetic structure and your brain chemistry. So you're not morally responsible for that. Hey, okay. After a while, what authority does the Bible have any longer? So I think theistic evolution undermines the authority of growing in Christ, even though there might be a short-term benefit in a person getting in the door. The way he got in the door is not going to let him grow over the long run. Now, the second thing I want to deal with is a very serious question, and that's, when is it okay to disagree with what the majority of experts in a field believe? If I went and had 100 oncologists and 95 of them told me that you need to do this, and 5 of them told me I needed to try natural remedies instead, and they all had health food stores, I'm going to go with the 95, aren't you? If you had 95 realtors say this is a bad house to buy, and 5 said it's okay, I'm going with the 95. I'm going to go with the majority of experts, and unless something happens. Because when it comes to evolution, I do exactly the opposite. Because the overwhelming majority of the experts believe the theory of evolution is true. Now, am I rational in doing that? Or am I just doing it because I can't stand giving them a Bible? I have Jesus in my heart. No, that's not why I do it. If there are 2 conditions present, then you are justified rationally in going against the majority of experts, if these 2 things are present. Number 1, if the majority opinion is based on non-rational factors. In other words, if the majority opinion is not based on the evidence, but it's based on non-rational factors. Is that true of evolution? Yes. There are 2 reasons that evolution is accepted by the majority of biologists and scientists today. And number 1 is because it got theology and God out of science. Probably one of the best texts on the Darwinian Revolution, written by a historian at Georgia State, published by the University of Chicago Press, is Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation by Neil Gillespie. Gillespie makes the following statement about the Darwinian Revolution. Darwin's rejection of special creation was part of the transformation of biology into a natural science, one committed to thoroughly naturalistic explanations based on material causes rather than appealing divine intervention. Later he says, now listen to this is absolutely crucial. He says, just as science shifted from a theological ground to a naturalistic one, religion shifted from being a field that provided knowledge to one based solely on blind faith. Now the point is that scientists got tired of having to ask theologians what they had to believe. And so what Darwin did was allowed biology and paleontology to become purely naturalistic. So that while you're doing science, you have to adopt what's called methodological naturalism. You can only appeal to natural explanations, even though you may believe in God. So that wasn't evidence-based. In fact, Gillespie says that for the first 50 years or so, all the evidence was on the side of the creationists. It was against Darwin. Darwin didn't win on the evidence for the first 50 years. He won on the fact that he helped scientists naturalize their field and get theology out of their work. Secondly, the reason there's a majority opinion in science for evolution is the way young undergrads are sociologized into the field. They are ostracized with institutional rewards and punishments if they don't accept evolution and if they mention intelligent design. I was giving a talk at UC Berkeley a handful of years ago, an evangelistic talk to about 800 students. And before I spoke, I heard that Bill Dembski had come to Berkeley 2 weeks earlier and gave a lecture on intelligent design. Now, Dembski's a stinking genius. He's got 2 doctorates, one in math and one in philosophy, and he's no idiot. And the biology department boycotted the meeting and would not allow their grad or undergrad students to go hear him. Well, if he's such a doofus for believing in this stupid theory, sick your students on him and make a fool out of him in 5 minutes. The other thing this happened is I met a biology PhD student at UCLA, and he said he had developed an empirically testable intelligent design model for his doctoral dissertation, and he sent it to his supervisor, and his supervisor said, "Don't you even go close to this. I will not supervise this. Because if you touch this, you will never get your PhD, and I might lose my job. It won't work in this." So I believe that the reason that there's a homogeneous acceptance of evolution is that it allowed biology to get religion out of science, especially God. So intelligent design isn't science, allegedly, it's religion. And it's because of the way the sociology of the practitioners now function. It's not based on evidence. That's reason number 1. Criterion number 2, for when it's reasonable to go against the authorities, even though they're in the majority, is not just there's an alternative explanation besides their rational evidence, but it is if there is a small rebel group of highly trained, educated, skilled practitioners who publish in peer-reviewed journals and in high-quality books and who have provided an alternative paradigm. Thomas Kuhn said that sometimes, the philosopher of science, sometimes those rebel groups bring about a revolution and overturn the old theory. What we have in intelligent design today is not your granddaddy's creationists. These guys are SMART. And it's, by the way, it's about time Christians celebrated people that have credentials. I'm tired of pastors saying, you know, Jesus is for everybody. We don't care about being credentialed and all that stuff. Baloney. You need credentialed people. Jesus is for everybody. I'm for a blue-collar family. But we need credentialed people in the church who can defend what we believe in the highest levels of academia. Now, what we've got today is an unbelievably skilled rebel group of highly trained. You get the book Theistic Evolution. If you're in here and you're a theistic evolutionist, look at the qualifications of the people who publish in that, and that'll be enough. Thank you very much.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.